Before 1944, invading a heavily fortified coastline was considered by most military strategists to be a mathematical impossibility. You either sank in deep, treacherous waters, or you were systematically slaughtered while clumsily climbing over the high wooden sides of your own naval boats. The Axis powers understood this fundamental physical limitation of amphibious warfare perfectly well. They built their entire defensive doctrine around it, constructing the terrifying reality of the Atlantic Wall. This was not merely a wall, but an intricate, overlapping matrix of thousands of miles of reinforced concrete bunkers, submerged anti-tank obstacles, and precision-sighted MG-42 machine gun kill zones capable of firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute. The traditional amphibious doctrine, which relied on pulling up parallel to a beach and having men scramble over the gunwales, was completely obsolete in the face of this mechanized industrial defense. To assault this fortress from the sea, the United States military did not just need a new tactical approach, they required a radical new machine, an impossible vessel that defied the established laws of naval architecture. The mechanical flaw of traditional landing craft was deeply rooted in their foundational design. Standard naval boats featured high gunwales, built to keep rough ocean water out and keep the crew safely inside. But for an infantryman heavily burdened with over 60 pounds of combat gear, ammunition, steel helmets, and waterlogged canvas, these high sides transformed the boat into a floating wooden prison. To disembark under heavy enemy fire, soldiers had to physically heave themselves over the rigid edge, exposing their entire bodies to enemy snipers and machine gunners, before dropping blindly into unpredictable, churning coastal waters below. This archaic method resulted in mass drownings, shattered legs from the sheer weight of the drop, and entire platoons being wiped out while serving as slow-moving, defenseless targets struggling in the brutal surf zone. The military urgently needed a vessel that could eliminate this fatal transition phase entirely. The answer came not from the polished halls of the Pentagon, nor from the elite academic naval shipyards of the East Coast, but from the muddy, unpredictable, and hazardous waterways of the Deep South. Enter Andrew Higgins, a hard-drinking, fiercely independent boat builder and former rum runner from New Orleans. Higgins had spent years designing specialized rugged vessels to navigate the shallow, log-infested swamps of Louisiana. His masterpiece at the time was the Eureka boat. It featured a revolutionary spoonbill bow, a flattened, upward-curving front section that allowed the boat to aggressively ride up onto riverbanks or submerged logs without sustaining catastrophic structural damage. More importantly, the shallow draft and specialized hull shape allowed the Eureka boat to beach itself firmly on solid ground and, using the powerful raw torque of its rear-mounted engine, independently reverse back into the deep water without getting hopelessly stuck. It was an engineering marvel for swamp navigation, a true survivor of the backwaters. But it still suffered from the same fatal military flaw as the others. The bow was solid, impenetrable wood. To get out, the men still had to jump over the high, vulnerable sides. The United States Marine Corps, observing the rapidly escalating global conflict and the need to project power across vast oceans, issued an unprecedented and seemingly impossible demand. They required a true, devastating frontal assault capability. They needed a vessel that could not only survive the brutal physical impact of crashing head-on onto a hostile, heavily defended beach, but could also deliver heavily armed men directly onto dry sand, shoulder to shoulder, instantly ready to fire their weapons the second their boots hit the ground. They did not want men climbing over walls, they wanted men charging through doors. To achieve this unprecedented offensive capability, the very structural integrity of the Higgins boat had to be deliberately and violently compromised. The solid, hydrodynamic wooden bow, the exact feature that gave the Eureka boat its immense strength, water-cutting ability, and buoyancy, had to be completely amputated. In its place, the military demanded a massive front-facing exit, a mechanical threshold that would fundamentally alter the geometry, the weight distribution, and the very soul of the boat. This bold demand set the stage for one of the most critical engineering gambles of the Second World War. The designers were forced to tear apart a perfectly functioning watercraft to build a specialized, highly dangerous delivery system for human lives, knowing full well that this single mechanical alteration would dictate the survival or the slaughter of millions of young men on the beaches of Normandy and the islands of the Pacific. The bureaucratic resistance to this idea was almost as formidable as the Atlantic Wall itself. The elite engineers of the United States Navy's Bureau of Ships looked at Higgins's proposed modifications with absolute disdain. According to the strict, uncompromising mathematical principles of traditional naval architecture, cutting the front off a boat and expecting it to survive the violent, unpredictable surf of an open ocean was sheer lunacy. A boat requires a sealed, pointed bow to displace water efficiently, to maintain forward momentum, and most importantly, to prevent the massive weight of the ocean from instantly flooding the hull. By amputating the bow, Higgins was essentially creating a massive, floating scoop that practically invited the sea to swallow it whole. The Navy argued that any vessel built to this specification would be catastrophically unseaworthy, prone to capsizing in even moderate swells, and would instantly sink the moment it attempted to navigate the treacherous coastal breakers. Yet, the brutal tactical reality on the ground outweighed the theoretical mathematics of the drafting room. The Marines knew that if they could not get their men onto the beach in a unified, overwhelming frontal wave, the war would be lost before the first shot was fired on dry land. The debate was over. The order was given. The bow had to go. To save the lives of the infantry, the engineers were forced to do the unthinkable. They had to take a perfectly engineered, highly functional wooden boat, brutally amputate its bow, and replace it with a massive, rust-prone steel guillotine. The integration of the steel drop ramp was a mechanical nightmare that defied every standard practice of naval construction and fluid dynamics. This was not a simple door swinging on a hinge. It was a heavy-gauge steel plate, reinforced with thick structural ribbing, designed to withstand the crushing, repeated impact of hitting solid land at full throttle, while carrying thousands of pounds of human cargo. Controlling this massive slab of metal was a complex, motor-driven winch system connected to high-tensile steel cables running along the gunnels. The operational parameter set by the military was absolute and totally unforgiving. The ramp had to drop, lock into a downward angle, and release a heavily armed platoon of 36 soldiers directly onto the wet sand in exactly 10 seconds. Any mechanical jam in the winch gear, any snapped tension cable under the stress of the ocean waves, or any hesitation from the operator meant absolute slaughter for the men trapped inside the wooden box. They would become sitting ducks for enemy artillery. But grafting a heavy steel ramp onto the front of a lightweight wooden boat created an immediate and terrifying hydrodynamic paradox. By cutting off the buoyant, water-displacing wooden bow and replacing it with hundreds of pounds of dead steel weight, the boat naturally wanted to nosedive directly into the ocean floor. The center of gravity was violently and unnaturally shifted forward. The vessel was constantly fighting against its own structural balance. To prevent the craft from instantly sinking under the sheer weight of its own mechanical exit door, Andrew Higgins had to implement extreme, almost reckless weight-saving measures throughout the rest of the hull. The desperate solution was the extensive use of marine-grade Philippine mahogany plywood. This specific engineered wood was incredibly light, relatively cheap to mass-produce, and pliable enough to be molded into the required semi-tunnel hull shape. It saved the boat from sinking and restored a fragile buoyancy, but it came with a horrifying operational cost for the soldiers. To keep the vessel afloat with the massive steel ramp attached to its face, the designers had to entirely sacrifice all defensive armor on the sides and bottom. The hull was merely 7/8 of an inch of plywood. The boat was, in its purest structural form, nothing more than a floating wooden crate sent to assault the most heavily fortified concrete positions on the planet. The mechanical reality of deploying this ramp in a live combat zone was intensely violent and chaotic. As the boat roared toward the hostile beach, fighting through artillery geysers and sea mines, the coxswain, positioned completely exposed at the rear helm, held the fate of 36 men in his grease-stained hands. He had to operate the wheel, manage the roaring diesel engine, and control the winch mechanism simultaneously. The moment he felt the flat bottom of the wooden hull violently scrape and shudder against the submerged sandbar, he had to disengage the heavy locking mechanism and release the cable tension. From there, raw gravity and forward momentum took complete control. The heavy steel ramp detached from its vertical lock and slammed downward with a bone-shaking metallic crash, crushing into the surf and acting as an instant, rigid mechanical bridge over the churning coastal water. But this mechanical sequence required absolute, flawless tactical timing. If the coxswain misjudged the depth in the chaos of battle and deployed the ramp even a few seconds too early, while the boat was still navigating deep water, the massive open front would act like a giant forward-facing scoop. The churning ocean would instantly flood the open cargo hold, and the 14-ton vessel, weighed down by heavily geared men and water, would sink like a stone to the bottom of the sea, trapping everyone inside a dark, watery grave before they could even fire a single shot. Yet, the true psychological and tactical horror of the Higgins boat was revealed in the very moment its machinery functioned perfectly. This was the grim paradox of the fatal funnel. During the chaotic, terrifying approach toward the coastline, the raised steel ramp actually served as the only significant piece of frontal armor on the entire vessel. Measuring 1/4 of an inch thick, it was capable of absorbing and deflecting standard enemy small arms fire and shrapnel, providing a brief, psychological illusion of safety for the 36 men packed shoulder to shoulder in the dark, vibrating, diesel-choked cargo space. But the exact fraction of a second the winch was released and the ramp crashed down onto the sand, that protective shield vanished completely into the earth. The boat instantly transformed from a protected transport vehicle into a mechanized death trap. The rectangular opening, created by the dropped ramp, provided absolutely zero lateral cover. It forced all 36 men to exit through a single, narrow, heavily restricted choke point. To the veteran German machine gunners waiting securely in their reinforced concrete bunkers on the cliffs above, this open ramp was not an exit for the Americans. It was a perfectly framed target, a mathematically precise, pre-sighted kill zone. The moment the heavy steel fell away, the men inside were completely exposed to the open air, staring directly down the barrels of overlapping machine guns, forced by the sheer mass of the men pushing behind them to run straight forward into a solid wall of supersonic lead with absolutely nowhere to hide. It defied every established rule of academic naval architecture. The LCVP was, in its purest mechanical essence, a vessel intentionally designed to commit an act that would instantly destroy any other ship. It was built to crash directly into solid land at full throttle. To achieve this impossible feat, without tearing the bottom out of the hull, Higgins had to solve a catastrophic hydrodynamic problem. The propeller is universally the most fragile and vulnerable component of any watercraft. In the context of an amphibious assault, the coastal water is exceptionally shallow, churning with violent surf and heavily littered with hidden sandbars, jagged rocks, submerged anti-tank obstacles, and floating debris. If a standard naval propeller strikes a solid sandbank or a piece of jagged steel, the soft bronze blades will shear off instantly. The rotational shaft will violently warp, the engine will seize, and the boat will be left dead in the water, a paralyzed, floating coffin for the 36 men trapped inside. To overcome this fatal vulnerability, Higgins engineered a radical mechanical solution, directly inherited from his years building swamp boats in Louisiana. Instead of letting the propeller hang exposed beneath the flat keel, he designed a specialized semi-tunnel hull. He carved a recessed, hydrodynamic cavity directly into the aft bottom section of the wooden hull. Inside this inverted pocket, he housed the propeller and the vital drive shaft, effectively shielding them from any direct lateral impacts from the sides. But the true genius of the design lay directly beneath the blades. Higgins integrated a massive solid wooden skeg, a heavily reinforced structural fin that extended downward below the lowest point of the propeller's rotational arc. When the 14-ton loaded vessel approached the hostile beach at 12 knots, it was this dense wooden skeg that took the brutal physical punishment. It scraped violently across the submerged sandbars and slammed into hidden logs, acting as a heavy-duty physical bumper. This mechanism allowed the fragile bronze propeller blades to continue spinning freely and safely within the protected water of the tunnel above it, maintaining vital forward thrust even as the boat physically dragged its belly across the ocean floor. The raw mechanical power required to force this massive, blunt-nosed wooden box through the churning surf was immense. The brutal heartbeat of the LCVP was typically a massive 225 horsepower grey marine diesel engine. In the broader realm of military vessels, its top speed of roughly 12 knots was agonizingly slow, making the approaching boats highly vulnerable targets for German artillery spotters. However, the engineering priority for the Higgins boat was never forward velocity. It was extreme, low-end rotational torque. The engine's true mechanical purpose was not merely to push the boat onto the beach, but to tear it off. Once the heavy steel ramp was dropped and the platoon of infantry emptied out, the flat wooden hull was left driven hard into the wet sand. The physical suction created by over 10 tons of weight resting on saturated earth is immense. To escape the kill zone, the diesel engine had to instantly reverse its massive torque. The propeller would violently churn the water within the semi-tunnel, generating enough raw, backward thrust to physically rip the wooden hull away from the vacuum of the sand, dragging the craft back out into deep water to retrieve another load of men. This brutal operational requirement meant the engine had to frequently operate at absolute maximum RPMs, while the boat was completely stationary. Inside the cramped, uninsulated wooden box of the troop compartment, the sensory experience was horrific. The raw acoustic trauma of this unsilenced diesel engine roaring at full throttle reverberated through the plywood walls. It was deafening, rendering verbal communication between the soldiers absolutely impossible, and adding a deeply disorienting layer of physical vibration to the sheer terror of the impending assault. The men stood shoulder to shoulder, choking on thick diesel exhaust fumes mixing with the salty spray of the ocean, waiting for the mechanical clank of the winch that would signal their entry into the fatal funnel. Yet, the most terrifying aspect of the Higgins boat was the ultimate compromise of its armor profile. It was a masterpiece of specialized fluid dynamics, but it was an absolute failure as an armored personnel carrier. To maintain the delicate buoyancy required to keep the heavy steel ramp afloat, the engineers had been forced to deliberately strip away all defensive weight. The armor profile was a study in horrific mathematical odds. The only substantial ballistic protection on the entire vessel was the quarter-inch steel plating on the front ramp and the tiny, curved shields protecting the gunners at the rear. The vast majority of the hull, the entire sides, the bottom, the very walls of the cargo hold where the assault troops stood exposed, was constructed solely from 7/8-inch thick marine plywood. Against the ferocious, industrialized firepower of the Atlantic Wall, this wood was essentially paper. It offered absolutely zero ballistic protection against heavy artillery shrapnel, the high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds of the German MG-42 machine guns, or even basic mortar fire. If an enemy artillery shell exploded in the water nearby, the kinetic energy of the jagged hot metal shrapnel would shred straight through the thin wooden sides without slowing down, instantly killing or maiming the tightly packed men inside before the ramp ever touched the sand. The coxswain, standing at the very rear helm, was completely exposed from the chest up. His hands gripped the mechanical wheel and the brass throttle levers, serving as the nerve center of the entire chaotic operation, yet he had no armor plating protecting his head or torso. Beside him, mounted on the rear gunwales, were two 30-caliber Browning machine guns. The gunners operating these weapons were theoretically supposed to provide suppressing fire as the boat approached the heavily fortified beach. However, standing on a violently pitching, unstable wooden deck, deafened by their own roaring engine, and firing upward at heavily fortified, perfectly stabilized concrete bunkers built into the cliffs, their fire was wildly inaccurate. They were essentially firing blind against an invisible, deeply entrenched enemy, their weapons serving mostly as a psychological comfort rather than a genuine tactical advantage. The United States Military Command knew this grim reality. They accepted the profound vulnerability of the wooden hull as a mathematical certainty of war. The LCVP did not rely on defensive plating to survive the assault. It relied entirely on the sheer, overwhelming numerical volume of its production and the desperate, suicidal speed of its mechanical deployment. It was a high-stakes gamble of human flesh against industrialized concrete, a fragile wooden bullet fired straight into the heart of an impenetrable fortress. In November of 1943, a catastrophic miscalculation of celestial mechanics and ocean tides turned the brutal genius of the steel drop ramp into a mechanical death trap of unprecedented scale. The United States military launched Operation Galvanic, the amphibious invasion of the Tarawa Atoll in the Pacific Theater, with the primary objective of seizing the heavily fortified island of Betio. This small strip of sand was heavily entrenched and defended by thousands of elite Japanese naval infantrymen. To crack this fortress, the military relied almost entirely on the mechanical delivery system of the Higgins boat. However, a fatal flaw in geographical intelligence was about to collide with the rigid physical limitations of the LCVP. Despite its incredibly shallow draft and innovative semi-tunnel hull, the heavily loaded 14-ton wooden boat still fundamentally required at least 4 feet of ocean water to safely clear submerged obstacles and reach the shoreline. Military planners had painstakingly analyzed tidal charts, calculating that the rising tide on the morning of the assault would provide exactly enough depth for the massive fleet of Higgins boats to glide smoothly over the expansive, jagged coral reefs that formed a natural defensive ring around the island. But nature did not conform to the mathematics of the drafting room. A rare and devastating hydrological phenomenon known as a neap tide, or a dodging tide, occurred. The ocean simply did not rise. As the invasion hour approached, the water depth over the razor-sharp coral reef remained stubbornly and fatally at a mere 3 feet. The result was an industrial-scale catastrophe. As the first massive wave of hundreds of LCVPs roared toward the beach at full throttle, their flat wooden bottoms violently slammed into the solid, unyielding coral reef hundreds of yards away from the dry sand. The brilliant wooden skeg, the precise mechanical feature that had allowed the boat to effortlessly slide over soft mud, slippery sandbars, and rotting river logs in Louisiana, was utterly useless against solid, jagged volcanic rock. The violent kinetic impact tore into the mahogany plywood. The boats lurched to a sudden violent halt, completely immobilized, grinding their hulls against the reef. The massive diesel engines screamed as the coxswains desperately threw the throttles into maximum reverse. But the propellers only churned useless white water. They could not generate enough raw thrust to pull the heavy vessels off the rocky trap. The entire assault wave was instantly paralyzed. Hundreds of wooden boats were now physically stuck in the exact center of the pre-calculated, meticulously sited kill zones of the Japanese coastal artillery. They were sitting ducks. With the boats immobilized, taking direct mortar hits, and rapidly filling with water and blood, the coxswains faced a horrific mechanical ultimatum. They could not reach the beach, and they could not retreat. They had absolutely no choice but to activate the winches and drop the heavy steel ramps right where they were, hundreds of yards out in the churning, hostile ocean. When the heavy steel doors crashed down onto the submerged reef or directly into the deep, turbulent water just beyond the coral ledge, the terrifying reality of the fatal funnel was magnified exponentially. The ramp no longer acted as a bridge to dry land. It acted as a diving board into a watery hell. The heavily burdened Marines, carrying over 60 pounds of combat gear, ammunition, and waterlogged canvas, stepped off the mechanical ramps and instantly plunged into deep, hidden underwater craters carved into the coral. Dozens of men sank like stones, drowning instantly under the massive weight of their own armor before they ever had a chance to fire their weapons at the enemy. Those who miraculously managed to find solid footing on the treacherous reef were faced with a nightmare scenario. They were forced to wade through 500 yards of waist-deep, sometimes chest-deep water to reach the shore. The sheer physical resistance of the ocean meant they were moving at an agonizingly slow, exhausted pace. They were entirely stripped of the momentary speed and shock value that the LCVP was designed to deliver. Completely devoid of any lateral cover or armored protection, these slow-moving lines of men became perfectly framed, helpless targets. From the fortified concrete bunkers and palm log pillboxes on the island, Japanese machine gunners unleashed a relentless, cross-cutting hail of supersonic lead. Artillery shells rained down, turning the blue ocean into a churning crimson slaughterhouse. The mechanical exit of the LCVP, designed to be the ultimate instrument of rapid amphibious assault, had effectively become a gateway to a slow-motion massacre. The bloody disaster at Tarawa ruthlessly exposed the ultimate physical limitation of the Higgins boat. While it was a mechanical masterpiece for assaulting muddy riverbanks and soft sandy beaches, its flat-bottomed wooden hull and absolute reliance on specific water depth made it fatally useless against solid, submerged geological barriers. This harsh, undeniable mechanical truth forced the United States military command into a frantic, desperate tactical evolution. It rapidly accelerated the mass production of specialized, tracked amphibious vehicles, known as LVT Amtraks, which utilized mechanical tank treads to physically crawl over the sharp coral reefs and deliver men directly to the sand. Yet, despite the horrors of the reef, the military strategists also realized a grim logistical reality. While the Amtraks were absolutely necessary for the brutal, unpredictable coral atolls of the Pacific campaign, they were incredibly slow, highly complex to manufacture, and carried too few men. For the massive, continent-sized invasions planned for the expansive sandy shores of Western Europe, the raw industrial volume, the brutal speed, and the sheer mechanical simplicity of the wooden Higgins boat remained their only viable logistical salvation. To win a global war of this unprecedented magnitude, the United States military did not merely need a fundamentally sound boat design. They needed an absolute miracle of industrial logistics. They required a manufacturing facility capable of spitting out a highly specialized 36-man mechanical assault craft every few hours, non-stop, 24 hours a day, for years on end. The Axis powers, with their meticulous, handcrafted military engineering, severely underestimated the raw, brute force manufacturing capability of the American industrial engine. Andrew Higgins understood that the traditional methods of shipbuilding, where skilled artisans painstakingly crafted one vessel at a time from custom blueprints, were entirely inadequate for the mathematical demands of a two-front world war. To build the LCVP, Higgins had to completely revolutionize the maritime industry by forcefully integrating the high-speed assembly line mechanisms of the Detroit automotive factories directly into the muddy shipyards of New Orleans. He designed the Higgins boat not just for tactical combat, but specifically for aggressive mass production. Every single wooden plank, every bronze propeller blade, and every heavy steel ramp was strictly standardized to absolute microscopic tolerances. If a piece of mahogany plywood was cut in Factory A, it had to perfectly fit a hull being assembled in Factory B without a single second of custom modification. Because millions of young American men were currently deployed in combat overseas, the Higgins assembly line was not manned by traditional seasoned shipwrights. It was powered by a massive, dedicated civilian workforce, heavily consisting of determined women, the elderly, and individuals previously rejected by standard military drafting boards. Working in relentless, deafening shifts, this unprecedented army of amateur mechanics transformed raw timber and cold steel into functional war machines at a speed that paralyzed Axis military intelligence. At the absolute peak of its industrial output, the Higgins factory matrix was producing over 700 fully equipped fighting vessels every single month. By the end of the global conflict, this single, independently operated shipyard in Louisiana had churned out an astonishing 20,336 LCVPs. They were producing the boats faster than the German artillery could theoretically sink them. The ultimate, terrifying test of this mechanized swarm arrived on the gloomy morning of June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord, the amphibious assault on the beaches of Normandy. As the grey skies slowly lightened over the turbulent English Channel, the true scale of the Higgins manufacturing miracle was finally unleashed upon the heavily fortified Atlantic Wall. 1,083 Higgins boats were simultaneously deployed into the freezing, violently churning surf, charging relentlessly toward the heavily mined sands of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches. The acoustic footprint of the invasion was a deafening, synchronized mechanical symphony. Thousands of massive, unsilenced gray marine diesel engines roared at maximum throttle, their collective vibration physically shaking the surface of the ocean. Inside the cramped, vibrating wooden hulls, tens of thousands of terrified, seasick infantrymen huddled together behind the thin steel drop ramps, violently thrown about by the ocean swells, listening to the horrifying shriek of German artillery shells exploding in the water around them. When the flat, wooden bottoms of the Higgins boats violently ground into the submerged French sandbars, the mechanical sequence that would decide the fate of the free world was triggered. Across 5 distinct beaches, in perfect chaotic synchronization, the heavy winches screamed as the cable tension was released. The heavy steel ramps crashed down into the surf zone. The fatal funnel was opened. Thousands of heavily armed men poured out of the wooden boxes directly into the pre-sighted machine gun fire of the German defenders. The slaughter was immense, brutal, and mathematically expected. The wooden hulls of the LCVPs offered no protection against the relentless crossfire. They were splintered by mortar rounds and shredded by armor-piercing bullets. Yet, the sheer, overwhelming mechanical volume of the Higgins boats simply overran the defensive capacity of the Atlantic Wall. Every time a boat was destroyed, 2 more took its place, relentlessly vomiting platoons of fresh, heavily armed soldiers directly onto the contested sand, transforming a wild, natural coastline into an instant, high-volume military logistics port in a matter of hours. The LCVP fundamentally altered the geometry and the physical limitations of modern warfare. It did not achieve victory by being a flawless, impenetrable, heavily armored fortress. It was, in truth, a highly vulnerable, terrifyingly dangerous wooden box. It won the war through the sheer, unstoppable force of mechanized mass production and the integration of a single, brutal mechanical feature, the front-facing steel ramp. It solved the impossible mathematical equation of the amphibious assault by allowing the infantry to charge straight through the front door instead of climbing over the walls. Years later, reflecting on the logistical miracle that broke the back of the Axis powers, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, delivered his ultimate, unequivocal verdict on the stubborn boat builder from New Orleans. He stated, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. The impossible wooden machine, born in the treacherous swamps of the Deep South, had successfully delivered the salvation of the world. Thank you for exploring this mechanical marvel with us. But what happens when the battlefield shifts from the muddy, blood-soaked beaches to the freezing, oxygen-starved edge of space? Next time, we look up at the skies. We will uncover the story of how a rogue group of brilliant engineers, isolated in a circus tent, built a titanium ghost that flew faster than a rifle bullet, constructing an impossible machine using materials bought completely in secret from their greatest enemy. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the secrets of the SR-71 Blackbird.